All right, everyone, welcome once again. This is Damon Pistolka with the Faces of Business, talking with interesting people about life and business. And with me today, I've got Patrick Ward. Patrick, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Damon. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so today with Patrick, we're going to be talking about supply chain disruption planning. That's a mouthful, first of all, but it's something that's hitting us squarely in the face, it seems like every day now.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And it's something that I think that for probably about the last 40 years at least hasn't been something that we've really had to think a lot about because things have been running pretty well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Patrick. It really is that. And we talked a little bit before we got on, and we'll uncover some of that. But before we get into our topic for today, let's go back a ways and talk about your background and how you really got into supply chain, because that's not like, it's not super popular, first of all, but you've been in it a while. You've been doing a lot of different things with it. So just talk about it.
Yeah, so I actually started I've been in consumer packaged goods, CPG products, essentially my entire professional career. That started out really on the manufacturing side, domestically in the United States. And we were manufacturing, I was part of a group that started a packaging and balloon manufacturing operation from scratch in the US. Literally to the point of bolting machinery together. And then, we scaled from a garage activity into a full factory that was about 70,000 square feet with extensive printing equipment and all the rest of that. So I saw that business grow from nothing to where we had about 50 employees and had invested tens of millions of dollars. And I touched everything there from, as I mentioned, bolting things together all the way through doing sales internationally to major party goods and packaging companies around the world.
Awesome.
So I moved out of that and I started a company importing furniture directly into the US for sale to consumers. And that got me out of just the manufacturing side of things into the sourcing and all the rest of the supply chain activities, from managing other manufacturers all the way through to the logistics and delivery.
So was that selling e-commerce, or was that selling through physical stores?
We were doing e-commerce.
Yeah.
And that was a direct delivery model. So yeah. I saw furniture as a funny activity that there's a reason that there's not a whole lot of e-com furniture, and flat pack is a big deal. That the logistical side of that is extremely important because the damage rates are so high, and the actual shipping costs of moving furniture around are pretty insanely high.
Yeah.
And there's also, I mentioned damage, there's a reverse logistics aspect of it that I had no clue when we got into the business was going to be such a big part of it.
Yeah.
So I would have said that was a learn the hard way on e-commerce and logistics business activity. I eventually transitioned out of that into doing more consulting, and with a particular focus on helping companies establish their supply chains and advance. My ideal client when I started the consulting business was somebody who just signed up a mass market retailer. So somebody who didn't know how to do it, but they had a bright idea and wanted to move into those larger companies, but really needs the help on how are we going to deliver millions of dollars worth of product that is properly packaged on time, has all the quality assurance, has all the safety, is properly labeled, all of those things that you kind of don't think about when you're the creator who's just sold something. So that's what I would say my primary business is. During the time of COVID, like most people, everything's been hijacked by COVID. And I've ended up doing similar work primarily for companies that are working with Fortune 100 firms, like companies that major companies you would have worked with, where they've had supply chain failures and have really had to go out of their normal set of vendors to get those problems solved. Great example that I got is and I'm not going to name names, but there's a major company in the Bay Area that had in their SOPs, in their manufacturing processes, had specified Purell, like the brand Purell, as the only acceptable solution for, you know, keeping your hands sanitized.
Yeah.
You may remember that Purell was suddenly unavailable.
Yeah. Yeah. You couldn't get it for months.
Exactly. So what do you do? That
Yeah.
our SOPs say, I got to have Purell. There's no Purell. You know, how are we going to square this? Eventually, they, of course, had to make an exception on the SOPs and go back out and solve the problem that way. But that's a good example of where there was a supply chain failure with the traditional vendor. I think it might have been Purell. It may have been their reseller, but there was a supply chain failure there that required somebody to get in and sort the whole thing out and move forward. Mm-hmm. That was outside of the scope of not so much the scope of the supply chain activity, but the thinking of the supply chain team, that they didn't really have a perspective on how to solve the problem, which is something that I've seen across a lot of companies of, we've always been doing it this way, or we don't know what we're doing, and they need a fresh set of eyes on the problem.
Yeah, because there are things in your background. First of all, starting your wide range of background, you have seen warehousing operations, you've seen manufacturing operations, and you've seen supply chain operations and how you have to deliver those things. As you said, take CPG products going to mass market retailers. Most people don't have a clue what that means, other than it's woohoo, we got this big, you know, we're going out into, just for example, a Target, you know, and they have no idea what the next steps are in that.
Exactly. My wife and I actually, I'm thinking it would have been before COVID, but it was November, December, and we were walking through Target. And we stopped in an area of the store that I'd been working on some of the products in there. And my wife turned to me and said, nobody in this store knows the sheer amount of work that it took to get this product to this location.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's exactly. And so when you talk about that, and you talk about your history and your background and what you've done, you've had to figure some of these situations out. And let's back up a little bit and talk about, and we'll talk about more about helping in the mass market and supply chain in a more normalized environment. But one of the things you touched on when we first started here is we've lived largely in a period where there was lack of supply chain disruption. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean there?
Yeah, so the way I can think about this is, in the era since the end of World War II, we've had relatively few disruptions on a national and a global scale. Yeah, I can say that we had an oil shock and we've had, you know, the occasional crop failure here and there, but nothing on the scale of what you would have been used to living through if you'd been born in, say, 1840, where you would have seen several major wars across the entire world, that you'd have seen, you know, multiple rounds of the Dust Bowl. A lot of stuff like that happened, and that a lot of that, there's a sense that stopped happening around 1945. So I use my father as an example, who was born in 1941, and for essentially his entire life, nothing major has gone wrong. That I think the biggest event that he can remember was the 1964 Alaska earthquake. That was a big deal to him. Those sorts of shocks are kind of like par for the course for people who are younger, where they're seeing that sort of thing on a regular basis. The other thing that's happened during that period of time is, well, part of what the Cold War was keeping everything stable. Our government was really, really concerned with making sure that the Western world worked. The other thing that happened was we had the rise of China, but the Chinese government was also really concerned with making sure that China worked for us as customers. So we've had two forces coming together to make life really easy for a lot of people. And things have, for the most part, about the last, 80 years, really gotten a lot better for people and gotten a lot easier for people. And I see this as our first major disruption, a lot, going forward into a new era where there's going to be less stability, and we need to have this. We need to really be thinking about how we're going to address this from a supply chain standpoint.
Yeah, And that's interesting when you think about it, because yeah, there have been dips, the oil embargoes, but we've largely worked that out with different sources, and and there's been things like you said, crop failures, steel, whatever. There's been some.
We had 9/11. That would have been a big example.
9/11, that was a big thing for us. Even when you talk about Vietnam and Gulf War, things like that, they're obviously huge events, but they're not global type World War I, World War II, or COVID type events.
Yeah, nobody ran out of toilet paper during the 2008 financial crash. That was self-inflicted, and there was always food.
Yeah. It's interesting, and what that's basically done then is, from what you're saying, is because there's been a long period where there was lack of disruption. Do you think that allowed us to create supply chains that were a lot more fragile than we should have?
Yeah, I really do think that was the case, that we've really emphasized, we throw around words like, lean and agile and just in time. And all of those methodologies have a place, but what they've been really used to do is to cut costs. And the lack of disruption has served to mask the amount of risk that was being brought into these supply chains by progressively cutting costs. That I feel like every week there's another sector of industry that I find out is essentially down to extreme geographic concentration, or we're down to single source suppliers or near single sources on things. And that single source is great from the standpoint of controlling costs and getting the lowest possible price as a buyer. But single source carries an obvious risk that if it's a single source and that source goes down, what's your plan?
Yeah. I mean, both of those examples, extreme geographic conditions, something could happen. Like, there's just tons of things that could happen to really hose things up there, or the single source. And I think the single source now is where a lot of people have really fallen off, especially as you look at year over year comfort with, we need to drive costs down, and you go to bigger contracts with fewer suppliers, bigger contracts for fewer suppliers. And then pretty soon you're standing there and we've only got one supplier because we've tried to cut costs by going into bigger and bigger contracts with people. And then you're left in that situation.
Yep, you really are. And that's fine if I only care about whatever the next period is and nothing goes wrong. So, but in the long run, you are, of course, setting yourself up for a major problem.
Yeah. Well, I think about things and somewhat goofy things, or like not thought about things, are like bananas. I mean,
bananas is a great example.
Because they're derived from one plant, and we've got something that's attacking that plant now, and they don't know what they're going to do to replace it.
Yep. And as I'm not an expert on bananas, but
me either.
Read up about it, there is a real risk that in the foreseeable future, the next 10 years, we're not going to have bananas as we understand bananas today.
Yes.
Because it is just one type of banana that, I don't know. And this is where I would go back to the banana producers and that the entire supply chain that uses bananas, and be asking, what's the plan, guys? You can see this coming, but what's the plan? Are you going to substitute oranges and apples for bananas? Are you going to create a new banana area of the world that is free of the pathogen? What's the plan? But you got to be thinking about it.
Yeah. Because as you said, and I think this is a key thing that you talked about. Two key things. One is cost cutting was adding risk at each step we were doing this, and we didn't really understand that risk.
Yep.
And when you combine that, and that provides gains for this period or the time we're looking at, but it doesn't really consider the risk factor for the long term. That's one huge thing. Along with the fact that we were living in a time of too long of uninterrupted supply chains.
Yep. And uninterrupted supply chains allows you to do two things. You can demand lower prices because the perception of the risk is lower. And, as you mentioned earlier, not a lot of people are in supply chain. That's because for a long time, it was just kind of a place where nothing was doing. So you didn't have the best and the brightest going in supply chain. They're all off working at Google somewhere doing, marketing of some sort, not focused on supply chain.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. I mean, when you bring it to light the way that you did, talking about how long we've lived in period of just relatively minor disruptions, real short period of time disruptions, even you mentioned before we got on a hurricane or crop failure or something, but really in our environment now, a crop failure only means probably until that we go north or southern hemisphere, because we have the other crop coming off in 6 months from now. So that's about the farthest you're out. And the same kind of thing with a hurricane or something else. They're just not that devastating on a large enough scale that 6 months out, it's going to be a huge thing anymore.
Yeah. But unfortunately, and this is where geographic risk really comes into play, is Texas is the perfect example. A hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, we have a major freeze and another hurricane. And we've knocked down a lot of the high-end petroleum processing in this world. So we're out of all sorts of random products, from PVC pipe to foam.
Yeah.
So, had I thought about that? No, I'm not doing a lot of foam sourcing. But if your primary business, let's say you're your mattress firm, that your primary business is selling mattresses that require foam, you should probably have a pretty good idea of where that foam is coming from and what it means if there's a major problem and how you're going to mitigate for that. But we're just now coming around to the idea that we have to think our way through these things and come up with a plan to address the problem, however you may define the problem and however you may define the solution, but we actually have to have a plan.
Yeah, and it's a great example. I was talking to a friend of mine, actually on the show here. I had him on because he's been in injection molding for many years, and he's a technical person for a plastics company that sells the little beads that turn into all the plastic stuff that we do. And he was talking about how that in Texas there screwed up that industry so bad. And now it's bad enough that they came in and got a once every 250 year kind of freeze that went on, or 500 year, whatever. It was a horrible freeze for that area. But then he said you added the fact that COVID was preventing the workers from going in and working normally as they would in normal quarters, close quarters, all that. He said it just exacerbated the problem and significantly increased the time to come back online.
Yep.
So you make a great point. Is like, what are the chances of a historically low temperatures for an extended period of time in the southern part of the United States, along with a pandemic that we haven't seen since 1900s, when the early 1900s, when the Spanish flu was around.
Yep.
At the same time.
In abstract, that sounds like something that, what are the chances? Well, the pandemic had been going on for a while. So you had, at that point, I would have recommended that leadership say, this thing isn't going anywhere. So we are in a different risk environment and we need to recalibrate everything we're doing. Because that freeze didn't happen at the same time that COVID showed up. It happened, 6, 8 months after COVID had showed up, after it was obvious this was going to be a major problem. So I don't know what the thought process was of all of those companies in that supply chain, but at a certain point, it's obvious that the risk has increased in this environment.
You make a great point there, because even if it's not affecting you today, the fact that there is a problem should make us go back, and should at least cause us to go back and think about where else could we find problems, see problems, because we're now in a new situation.
Yep.
And it's almost like I'm always safe driving my car, but if I'm driving my car in this neighborhood that may not be quite as safe, maybe I need to recalibrate my thought process, and I shouldn't be rolling down a window or getting out of my car or whatever you want to call it. I'm just a horrible example probably, but something like that.
No, I think that's a great example of, as on a personal basis, it makes sense. This is a sketchy neighborhood. Maybe I don't leave my briefcase sitting on the passenger seat.
Yeah.
You've recalibrated your expectations of, well, not so much the expectation, but your perception of the odds that something bad is going to happen.
There you go. Yeah.
And obviously, if I have my laptop, I probably shouldn't leave it on the passenger seat anyway, but I'm going to be extra careful about that in certain areas versus in other areas. I'd probably be a lot less worried about it. Fancy shopping mall, I'd be like, who cares? Yeah. Right or wrong, that's my perception. We should do the same thing on a global, well, at least regional, but if not global scale, when we think about how to do business. That we've got fires going all over the Western United States right now. So what does that really mean? Well, in Colorado, it means that I-70 and the railroad with it got washed out a couple of weeks ago. So we've lost a major transportation corridor. We now know that that is a potential risk anywhere in the Western United States. So anybody who's listening to this who's moving stuff via rail or via truck should probably be looking at this and saying, is there a choke point in my transportation network that if that choke point went down, it would have a serious impact on me? What does that mean to me? And my guess is that for a lot of people, the answer is going to be yes. And at a bare minimum, you need to be aware of that. It would be better if you had a plan to work around that, but you need to have some basic understanding of the risk that you face.
That is a great piece of insight right there, because I wrote it down, because if you do have these choke points, it's like most things. Your supply chain is a system like any others. And if you look at your choke points, identify them first, and then go back to those, you're not wandering around trying to find where you really need to look. You need to look at those points like that are your choke points, that if this was able to do what it's doing today, how is that going to affect, and where are those spots along the case? And it's like I got 10 different sources. I can do multiple ways. It really doesn't matter. But when you get down to there is no other way to do this than that right there, those are the ones where you could key in on. Yeah.
And I see a lot of this as kind of expanded common sense. There's a lot of methodologies that we can use from the standpoint of like, let's rank the risk and let's decide the odds of this happening and what's the potential outcome and what's the financial impact of that. But it all comes back down to correctly identifying what the risks are and figuring out how you're going to live within those constraints, whatever they may be. And, you said 10 suppliers. In my little town, just north of San Francisco, I'm going to say there are 6 separate grocery stores. So the odds of the town running out of water today, out of bottled water today, are pretty slim. But I also know there's only 2 ways in and out of town. So if we have an earthquake, the odds that we run out of bottled water are really, really, really high.
Yeah.
And if I'm running my home as a business, I should be aware of that. And also, if I'm running a business in this town, I should be thinking about what that means to me. And you can expand that way of thinking out to the whole world and the rest of all the other things that touch you and are potential risks.
Well, and you make a good point. It's not just we're talking about it in business, but we should use this a bit in our personal lives as well when we think about things, because water is a great example. Mm-hmm. If you don't have water, that's a problem. It becomes a problem very fast.
Yep.
So we talk about these problems now, but are you seeing people do anything?
I think that the willingness to think about doing things is there, but I think we are in the midst of a cultural change from the old way of doing things to actually dealing with doing things. And I saw a lot of companies that I was working with vendors, working with the companies over the last year, where they accomplished a lot during the immediate emergency of COVID. And once that perception of emergency went away earlier this year, obviously it's back. The old way of doing things reasserted itself and kind of got people back to square one, where they weren't really prepared to address the fundamental issues. I'm guessing that this current Delta wave that we're in is probably going to shake things up a lot, but I'm not yet seeing on a massive scale across all the people that I talk to, fundamental reevaluation of like the way we're doing things and why. That's hard, that you got to have a lot of willingness to be introspective about yourself, about your company, about your culture, to really address those things. And there's a lot of things people are doing in their lives, and introspection isn't something that we're all particularly good at. I don't like thinking about all the things that are wrong with me. It kind of sucks.
Yeah.
Why do I want to do this every day?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you're right. I think that we got we all got tired of being kind of limited in what we could do. And when the light kind of started to turn back on, we were like, oh, great. And just a big sigh of relief, and everybody rushes out, and this is over. And mostly because we've lived this long time without these kind of challenges. And for us, certainly never saw anything like this at this scale, nearly closely by anybody's measure in our lifetimes. And
to your question about like changing culture, I don't think we're there yet. My wife is a business continuity consultant, that she works for a major consulting firm doing that. And so she sees all the job postings that come through. And there's a lot of people looking for a very junior person to do business continuity. You would think in the era of COVID, that would be a senior job, but we're not yet seeing the up-leveling of the responsibility. That senior management in a lot of companies isn't there yet.
Wow. Yeah. yeah. This is getting more interesting all the time. It's getting interesting all the time, because we have maybe this was a good wake-up call, maybe it wasn't, but you just don't know, and it certainly doesn't seem. And I'm not just talking about the fact that we ran through the COVID, or still in COVID, and all this good stuff. I'm just talking about the fact that the odds are against us living without these things for as long as we did before.
Oh, without a doubt they are.
And when you talk about anything that people can disagree or agree on or whatever, changing climate, fires, war, geopolitical, whatever you're talking about. I mean, we've been able to live in a, as you said, and I agree, it's a relatively undisturbed, huge, without undisturbed from huge overarching things like a world war or something like that. And I just get, it's kind of concerning that we aren't having more of the conversations around what are we really doing to work on, as we're talking about today, supply chain disruption, considering the fact that we've seen what we've seen over the last year. Mm-hmm. Just go over the last year and go, okay, how much did it really hurt your business over the last year because you couldn't get product for 3-4 months like you want out of the year? How much did it cost you because of that? How much did it cost you in the fact that you had stuff sole sourced out of one place in the world that couldn't ship you product for 5 months or whatever?
Or it's tied up in port right now because you didn't have your processes together to get it done sooner than last minute, which is what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah. So. And I had somebody on, I think it was earlier this week or last week. I had a few supply chain people on, but he was mentioning that I was flabbergasted at the price of container shipments from China to Long Beach. Because I mean, I grew up in the day where it was $3,000-$4,000, something like that, to bring a container, and now it got up over $15,000 to do it. And I was like, holy boy, that's a lot.
Yep. Certainly, I had the same experience when I first started shipping things overseas. plugged in $4,000. Yeah, it might have been 3,800. It might have been 4,200. I didn't know what it was going to be at the end of the day, but I knew it was going to be about $4,000. Like,
Yeah.
who cares? And it was really eye-opening to get caught in this cycle of increased prices and not being able to push that through. Because when you negotiate those things, when you're putting these chains together, you think you're going to sell for this much, and that requires pricing to be here. Well, it's ratcheting up on you.
Yeah, and when you think about that, and you go, if I'm going to sell something into a mass market retailer, and I'm going to sell it for, just say I'm going to sell it for $10, and on a container, a $10 item on a container, what do you think you can get? $200,000 worth of that on a container package? Sure. Probably not. Maybe
it is however much it is, but
however much it is, exactly. But if that price goes from 4,000 to 15,000, or goes up by $10,000, that's a significant amount when you look at the overall margins on your product that you're trying to do. Because at the other end, you don't just go, okay, we're gonna get to raise prices to you.
Yep.
And again, back to something else that you help people with in your mass market, understanding what you're taking things to the mass market retailers, understanding what the contracts really bind you to.
Yeah, and that's actually, container ships are a great example of where you need to understand how your supply chain is going to work and what your options are. So let's say that we're selling things to Walmart. And this is a theoretical example, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Walmart has the ability to pick up things in most overseas locations. They also are going to take a given amount of stuff where you are going to provide the transit worldwide for Walmart. So let's say you deliver it in Los Angeles instead of delivering it in Shenzhen. If you can get Walmart to take it overseas, your transportation problem is solved. Walmart has the scale that they can either raise prices, they control the prices, or they can keep that overall price level low. Versus if I, Patrick, doing business as Patrick Inc., am getting 10 containers from overseas, I have no control, and I'm at the mercy of the market. In that scenario, I'm a price taker. So the question is, what can I do to lock in that price? The answer is very little, because the freight lines are just not honoring locked in pricing. Or can I work with my vendor, not my vendor, but my customer, so that they take it earlier on, so that I don't get killed and we continue to provide the solution to the final consumer. But yeah, I think that's a great example where you have to think back through what is really possible and where you can make the changes. Yeah. And it may be difficult. It may require some difficult conversations. But get those conversations going now. Get everybody attenuated to the idea that we're going to have to do something different, and don't wait till it's a failure.
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of businesses have gone under in the last year and a half because they haven't dealt with it, and they just didn't have the uncomfortable conversations with what they needed to do. So as we look forward in some of these things, I mean, some people would look at it and say, hey, we just need inventory. Some people need whatever. So what are you thinking some of the things that we really need to do when we're looking at, I'm an OEM manufacturer in the middle of the United States. I've got global supply chains, things coming from everywhere. I mean, what are some of the things that we really should be doing?
Well, I look at it as there's a procession of things that you should do. We've talked a lot about understanding your supply chain and understanding your risks. So that's really like the top level item is, if you do nothing else, at least dig into everything and make sure you understand your entire chain. You go digging underneath, the stuff over there where you've got 3 suppliers, to make sure that they're not sole sourcing from somebody else, so that you figure out where you actually have these risks. So once you've done the analysis, number 2 would be, in my mind, you've got to process that and see what is worth the investment. So you mentioned, should we, bring on more inventory? That's kind of like down on my list of things to do. That I'd like to instead see, can we do something with our existing supply chain to reduce our overall risk. That are we going to be late for, because I do a lot with mass market, are we going to be late for Christmas? How can we not be late for Christmas? Well, we can stick with our design and production timelines so that we're not shipping late. So that means going back through the entire business and saying, when we say we need to start developing for a holiday 12 months in advance, actually getting it done. Not waiting for 6 months and then rushing it and then asking supply chain to pick up the slack and expedite everything. So I think examining processes is probably number 2. And only after that, and when you've said we've tightened up our processes, this entire organization now understands what we need to do. Now we can have a discussion of, do we bring on additional supplier? Do we bring on excess inventory? And really looking at those as tactical mitigation responses rather than a primary way of doing things. So I'd rather tell you that your business can run better today by making sure your product design team actually designs on time. And yeah, these are going to be hard things to do. Nobody wants to be wrong about things. But making sure you hit those timelines up front is going to be a lot better than missing Christmas.
Yeah. And that's a great point, because it's like you said, we've been able to, because there's not been many disruptions, we can accelerate the supply chain if we need to. And we've kind of gotten used to that.
We have gotten used to that. So,
and it's just not going to be the case. I mean, because the example is like when they were stopping production of very popular automobile lines in the US because they couldn't get IC chips or other products, or you know, major truck manufacturers, as in one of my friends runs an upfitting company and a larger one on the West Coast here, and they're getting trucks delivered without the hardware to roll the windows up on the driver and passenger side, you know, and that's going to be added later, but they don't have it now. I mean, what were these people doing? I mean, what was going on?
I do wonder exactly what were they doing. That I thought a lot about that one because it's such a major failure of the supply chain. But I've got to believe that it comes back down to, and we know that with the car companies, let's be clear, they have, as far as we're concerned, all the money in the world. They have there's no lack of resources.
Yes. Exactly.
But I view that one fundamentally as a cultural thing. That if, to pick on GM, if you worked for GM, you're used to your vendors being super willing to do whatever they can to get your business. You're not used to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing being like, you guys canceled your orders and we sold it all to Apple. We don't really care about you. You know, that this is something where you've again, in the overall strategic view of your supply chain, you didn't understand where you really fit into that market, which was you are a secondary or tertiary customer for that semiconductor line, not a primary customer where everything was going to be done for you.
And when the overall capacity got shrunk back, the secondary and tertiary customers are the ones that paid the price.
Yep, because we had the disruption. Those we know with the auto guys, they didn't know what was going on, so they canceled all their orders on the assumption they were just going to be able to turn it back on, and that capacity either went away permanently or was given to somebody else who, you know, I don't know, let's say Microsoft wanted more Xboxes because everybody's going to be at home. Well, you know, Microsoft got there first, guys. That's kind of the way it is. Yeah.
They took the capacity and it wasn't there for them to use. And the capacity had already leaned out to where these kind of changes are hard to ramp up. It's just amazing to me. But now that you look at it, you go back and you look at it, like you said, you know, we've lived for so long with relatively few long-term supply chain disruptions that you can see why it's happened.
Oh, totally. And with the semiconductor shortage for cars, that's one where I view that as a failure of just-in-time manufacturing, that nothing happened for however many years. You know, we never had a problem. We were using more chips. There was never a problem. There was always enough. And you could lean down your inventory of chips, lean it down, and just-in-time was working. But that lack of disruption masked that underlying risk of what happens if. And, you know, we got the if. So, I'm sure that there were plenty of analyst calls with the Wall Street firms where they said, why are you guys holding so many chips? And, again, the pressure was to reduce the amount of inventory on hand.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I can see both sides of this one. I still think it's unacceptable, but I can see both sides of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because it is hard to comprehend. I mean, it's hard to comprehend that an automotive company, any of them really, can't find them.
Yep.
You're not going to be able to produce cars. You're going to, put that whole thing into a standstill because you can't get a few of the items you need to get for that.
Yep.
And yeah. Anyway, it's an example of, and you said, like you said before too, the stuff in Houston with the specialty products and the freeze and the COVID. I mean, we've had so many things in the last year that have combined together to really make this interesting, if nothing else, for the people standing on the outside.
My hope is that people in these different industries look at this, and people in small businesses as well, and say, what can I do with my operations today to at least have, I'm not even saying having a plan, just have a recognition of what the risk is, that at least then you're not snowing yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we're talking about big problems, big companies. Now, how are you seeing, or do you get around like localish businesses and see the things that are happening with them that really change that too?
Yeah, with the local businesses, it's a harder sell. I view that as more of a design challenge than anything else. But it's a harder sell to go back to you and say, hey, what you really need to do is, I know you're always short on cash, that you got 4 employees and you don't know how you're going to make rent next month, but you really got to go do whatever that's going to cost you $100,000. Nobody's going to do that.
Yeah.
But a good example is I'm working with a company right now that is standing up a new seafood line that they're intending to ship from the East Coast into the Mountain West. And there I feel like it can add a lot of value because they're going to have to pack seafood somewhere, right? It's got to be packed and frozen. There's an obvious risk of, if your packer's refrigeration goes down, what are you going to do? The mitigation is pretty simple. We just need to find another packer. But because we're seeing that up front, this is going to be not costly versus the day that the primary packer says, sorry, we burned up yesterday. We know you got, seafood on the way, but we can't do anything about it. That's a major problem versus if we've already identified plan B, that's a relatively minor problem of just turning the truck a different direction.
Yeah.
So for local businesses, that's really where I see that you have an opportunity in the design phase of your business of really figuring out what you're going to do and how you're going to be doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example because it is, when you're thinking about it in the beginning, thinking again of those points where you could have problems and working through that, it's a lot less costly than it is when you're dealing with it at the end.
Yep. It's a classic, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That if we can do that up front, and this really starts on the small scale and works up. If we can design more resilient systems, or at least be aware of our faults, then we're going to be in a lot better shape.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Good stuff. It's so fascinating to me. When you look at the perspective that you outlined, we've lived in this time without disruption. The lean and the other things have allowed us to be kind of lulled into the fact that we're increasing risk by reducing inventory and sole sourcing and getting really focused geographically on our sources from a product. What are some of the things that you think we're going to see 5 years from now?
That's a great question. I think we're going to see a lot of emphasis on companies being scrappier and able to stand up their own supply chains in locations they haven't been doing it before, whether or not that's domestically or in areas like the Americas where we're not doing as much manufacturing as you might think we're doing. That's going to require that we bring a lot more resources in-house versus just outsourcing everything to a supplier in China who can kind of do the whole thing for us. That's been the way we've been doing things, and I don't think that model is going to be considered acceptable going forward. I do think we're going to see higher prices as a result, and frankly, I think that we should see higher prices. That our low prices are, it's like cheap, empty calories. It feels good right now, but we pay a price later.
Yeah. I've thought that for a number of years, is that we are living in a false sense of reality with our pricing, and I think that's across the board. I think it's energy. I think it's products. I think it's everything. We're going to have to come and pay the price sooner or later. And I think you're right, because when you look at the way a company is set up, it's not going to be as simple to just go, okay, take Boeing, for example. And I don't know. So if someone says I'm wrong, but the fuselage is designed and manufactured by somebody else. The wings designed and manufactured by somebody else. Boeing lays out the designs and stuff to a certain extent, but how much they do compared to somebody else, like you're saying, it might have to be in-house, because then we can specify what we want. That can go to 6 different places and get done, and we may have to do some more of it ourselves.
Yeah, and I think Boeing's a good example that all the things get outsourced in Boeing. If I were Boeing, I'd be looking at the world saying, what of our core competencies should be understanding our entire manufacturing process, not just the plane design and the plane marketing, but manufacturing planes is really what we do. We better understand how these things are manufactured. Yeah. And it shouldn't be a shock when we find out that we couldn't design air conditioning to save our lives or whatever it is. Yeah.
That's good stuff. It's really interesting, because I think we're at a crossroads here, and I think we're going to be a lot of exciting stuff in your world and supply chain, and really figuring some things out, and causing us to rethink too. I mean, it is going to make some companies rethink, because if you look at lost opportunity because of the supply chain disruption, and what that really costs, I think we're going to see a lot more, if nothing else. If we see more duplicate suppliers rather than sole source suppliers and things like that, that will help us a lot. And as you said, get it out of the same geographic zone and those kind of things. It could really make a difference.
Yeah. I don't know how that's going to play out, but I know that the pressure is going to be on to get that done. That there's just no way that we can continue to operate with what's going on right now. So
yeah, it's good stuff. Well, we have one more thing we got Peter stepped in said excellent discussion. Thanks for listening, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate that.
But Patrick, it was awesome having you on today, because this kind of stuff, as you said, this usually just happens in the background, and we're sitting here going, the products show up, we get, in manufacturing, in retail, and all this, and we work on all these little details around the outside. But this has really given us some challenges that are kind of cause us to rethink the way we source products around the world, around this corner, and how we run our businesses.
And Damon, I really appreciate the conversation. That it's going to sound funny. It's good to be heard on these things. That a lot of people I started explaining this. They're like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Oh man, this is going to suck.
Yep. Good stuff. Well, Patrick, if someone wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, you can reach out to me obviously on LinkedIn. Patrick Ward, or you can reach out to me directly at my email, patrick.ward@isc-na.com. My company is called International Supply Consulting, and the website is isc-na.com.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, thanks so much for being here today. Thanks everyone for listening to Faces of Business. We appreciate you. We love your input, and we hope you're going to be back again next week with us. Oh no, next week I am taking a summer break. It's awesome. We're going to enjoy a little August time off, and we will be back the following week after that with some more guests talking about interesting things in life and business. Thanks so much.
Thank you.